Hello and welcome to the Catholic Homeschool Podcast. I'm your host, Paola, and today's podcast is all about seeing history through the Catholic lens. I am thrilled to invite Christopher Zehnder with me today. He's the general manager, the editor, writer. Well, we'll get to know him in just a minute. Hello, Christopher. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So good. I was just telling Christopher before we hit that button here that I've known him for many years, and this is the first time we get to talk in person. So we're going to make this time here a time to get to know Christopher and to know the work that he is doing to help us families in teaching history, again, through a Catholic perspective. So without further ado, let me just get this part over with, Christopher, which is, reading the bio. Okay.
Right.
So Christopher Zehnder is the general editor of the Catholic Textbook Project. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California, and his master's from Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. He has taught history, theology, Latin, English grammar, composition, English literature, and universal literature at Catholic secondary schools in both Connecticut and California. He has developed curricula in history and language arts. And in addition to his work in education, Mr. Zehnder has authored a trilogy set in the German Reformation. And that first volume, which we'll talk about in a minute again too, is recently published by Arouca Press. He has edited 2 monthlies and written for various publications on historical, political, and theological subjects. He and his wife, Katherine, with their children, live in Central Ohio. Well, thank you. We got that out of the way. Good. A little background. But what it doesn't really say in there is something I found very interesting, which is you had sent me your interview with Marcus Grodi from Journey Home. Christopher, we have this growing community of homeschool teens in our community. We even have a teens now Catholic author group. So I really wanted to dive into your background, your journey as a convert to the faith. So let's begin when you were a teenager and fast forward to how in the heck did you get to where you are today?
That's always a hard question to answer because there's so much that goes into a conversion, and much of what goes into conversion, you often don't even know what they are. They're different influences. I was kind of an odd teenager. I liked reading and looking at maps, and I read all sorts of different things. So I guess I tended to be an intellectual almost from my early teenage years, if not before. I come from a historical faith. My family has been Lutheran since Martin Luther. They were one of the founding families of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so I always grew up with a sense of that history and the sense of a tradition, even though there was a time in my life I rejected all of that. I was influenced by the Jesus movement through my brother. But I did come, it was something that drew me back. So that sense of the beauty of that tradition. The liturgical tradition of the Lutheran Church is very similar in many ways to the Catholic liturgical tradition.
Yeah.
And in the music is that plays such an enormous part in Lutheran worship, particularly the works of Bach. So that's one of the things I've always missed being a Catholic, is I don't get to hear Bach preludes and postludes.
Exactly. I do have a friend who's a convert. He was a Lutheran minister, and the same thing. They missed. They actually, he's now a priest of the ordinariate, and partly I think because of the music. Yeah, and the whole congregation, would sing in heart. They would harmonize with each other, so that must have been a beautiful experience growing up with that.
Yeah, so I was drawn by that. There were lots of other things that went into it too, but the sense of the historical, I was early on drawn to when I was a teenager I was compelled to find the historical faith. That was a big part of it. And even though I rejected all of that at a certain point, it was always something that drew me at the same time. And through an influence of a very important man in my life, my Latin teacher in high school, a man named Kevin Long, and I was drawn towards the Catholic faith, even though he never told me he was a Catholic. He always told me he was a mere Christian. He taught in a Lutheran school, but I gradually understood where he was coming. I knew that ultimately he was Catholic, and it was through his influence I ended up going to TAC as well. But yeah, so those are the various different influences that came upon me. There was a Lutheran minister who was sort of a mentor to me, and he also was a theologian. He played musical instruments. He had a profound sense of beauty, and all that drew me towards the Catholic faith. I'm sure he doesn't like the idea that it drew towards the Catholic faith.
Exactly. Right.
But all those things were deep influences, and there were intellectual problems, intellectual questions that I struggled with as well. Like the whole question of authority. What is the authority for divine revelation? Where do we find the true interpretation of Scripture? Those things deeply troubled me. So ultimately, all those questions, the only answer that seemed to make any sense to me was the Catholic faith. In fact, at a certain point in my life, I thought, if the Catholic faith proves to be false, I'm not even going to be a Christian anymore. I figured it didn't make any, it wouldn't make any sense.
It wouldn't make any sense. Absolutely. Right. It's like, again, right.
That's sort of a very small encapsulation. As you know, my interview.
Yes. Well, I'll put the link for the Journey Home one because people should listen to it. It is, and because the reason why I bring this up is essentially because we tend to underplay what teenagers are going through. And the fact that you were questioning and seeking knowledge brings us then full circle to the importance of what books and materials we are feeding that thirst for knowledge. So, yeah.
Right. Before I talk about books, though, I just want to make a point of the importance of teachers and mentors, and how seriously we have to take teenagers. I taught teenagers for many years. I have raised them. I think sometimes we don't pay them sufficient respect, and we don't expect enough out of them. They can actually perform a lot more than we give them credit for, and we have to give them that confidence and sense that they can actually understand in education difficult material, that they actually have a high calling they have to follow. They're somewhere between children and adulthood, but they're more adults than they are children. I think that's something we have to always pay them that kind of respect and never speak down to them, never condescend to them. That's why I was a teacher. I tried never to do I didn't want to condescend to the students. I would speak to them like I was speaking to adults. I think that's a very important thing. What we give them to read is also extremely important, and on various different levels. On one level, what we give them to read should be good literature, well written. The classics, of course, students should have access to. In our reading material too, like in our classes, we would want to have, I think, books which are written well, which are intelligent, which are inspired by the love of learning and of wisdom, and which, we're all Catholic, they should be Catholic in orientation. We can talk about what that means in terms of history. I mean, it becomes difficult. Like when you're doing mathematics, what's Catholic mathematics?
Yes.
It's not counting rosary beads. There's no Catholic, really specifically Catholic mathematics. And as I'll talk about in a minute, in a certain sense, there is no Catholic history either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in many ways, it's why it's like I do like to preface that by the Catholic lens. Again, it's that understanding or faith and perceiving that through that perspective. So, I mean, one of the things, getting back to the teenagers, I can't, again, thank you for saying that, because very often, I think, especially with homeschooling parents, they tend to say, okay, I'm done. And they don't pay attention. It's the teenage years. We won't understand each other. But it's like that much more essential to actually get to know this fully formed person who has a calling for noble things, and being able to respect the dignity of that age and of that individual that's kind of on loan for such a short time.
Right. You're quite right about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it does go fast. I can, as a grandparent now, I can say all of that. So, good. Well, one of the things that always drew me, and again, I grew up New York City kid, so we learned current events. There was no sense of history. So when I am a revert to the faith, when I began to homeschool, it was not only a journey of my faith, but it was also a journey of history. And our family just loves, loves, loves history. And the one thing I really wanted to dive into is why I highly recommend these textbooks as that spine. I do homeschooling history, using history, family style for multi-ages is one of the frameworks. And I teach people to do that. But I use that book as the framework because of the things we're talking about. Let's talk about how that project started and what its mission is and why is it different than what's out there.
Okay, well, we began in the year 2000. So we had a meeting in Phoenix. I was living in California at the time. I'm a native Californian. We were living in Phoenix, and Michael Van Hecke, who was the president of our company, our first general editor, Dr. Roland Lassiter, a mutual friend of ours, Douglas Alexander. We all met, and we had an opportunity of getting some money to produce Catholic history books. Now, we had been in schools. I was teaching high school. Michael Van Hecke was a headmaster.
In Ventura, right?
This was when he was originally in Phoenix.
Oh,
and then he ended up in Ventura. That's why we were in Phoenix. Why else would you go to Phoenix?
yes.
But we all had the experience of trying to teach history in schools with substandard books. The problem is that there had been no Catholic texts published since the late 60s. And many of those books were not really adequate. It had to do with lots of different things. One of them is writing style. They were oftentimes written in a very dry, pedantic fashion.
Yeah.
They weren't beautiful to look at. Sometimes there's a kind of triumphalism or even a kind of extreme Americanism, which you find in these books. And we just didn't think that they were the sorts of books that actually evoke wonder. Mm-hmm. When I taught, we used one particular book, an old book at the school I was at. And I would just assign the readings, but my history classes I would do the research myself and take notes and present them. And the students, I don't know if all of them liked it, but there were those who did. So I took down I would take notes in lecture that way. So we thought we need to have books which are as colorful and attractive as a lot of the major publishers' books. Mm-hmm. But that's a very minor thing. What we wanted was, of course, Catholic books, and we can talk a little bit what that means in terms of history. But we also wanted books that evoked wonder and the desire for knowledge in students. And so what we landed upon was the idea of writing these books in a narrative fashion. Where basically almost like many of the good popular histories, Sheldon Foote, and you think of American history, are written in that narrative fashion, almost like telling a story.
Yeah, Nathaniel Philbrick's book on, Travels with George Washington, and he was a literature person who writes history, and again, making it accessible, telling us that narrative, the story, which is a really fascinating way for kids to be totally engaged in the story. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the goal we had. And the biggest problem, of course, was money. And we thought we had enough money. We'd gotten a woman had willed us some money to do this. And so, but we had nowhere near the amount of money to do it. It's extremely expensive proposition, what we set out to do, especially in those days when you actually had to buy all the pictures. Mm-hmm. We want to have a lot of pictures that were works of art, true works of art, not cartoon drawings and
yes, exactly. I think that's standard drawings. If anybody ever, and again, they can go to the website and see those pictures, but it's like really literally what makes the difference in many ways. It really captures the beauty again, the beauty. So yeah, you had to license those in the old days, right?
Yes, it was. It was very expensive, and I think that first book with pictures alone were $30,000.
Oh goodness! And that was a lot more than it is like
right
now.
In those days, we actually published with the Ignatius Press originally.
Right.
Don't ask me the date when we stopped, but we decided we would go form our own publishing company, which has been an adventure. We've had years we've struggled quite a bit, but now, I mean, we're actually doing very well. They're catching on. Schools all over the United States are buying them, and we're getting inquiries continually.
Yeah. You have new ones as well. And my son, when you did the Lands of Hope and Promise, which, again, there's nothing out there like that gives the perspective of Spanish history and the importance. We constantly, all the history books are always talking about the English coming, but they never talk about coming from the Spanish perspective. And they're closer, to us being Catholic.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I wrote that book, I was living in California. And so I had, you live in close proximity to Spanish culture. And it seemed to me that for two reasons why it was important. To understand the United States, you really have to understand her neighbors. And the most important neighbors are Latin America. You couldn't write a history of all the Latin American countries, so we included concurrent history of Mexico. So it starts with the Spanish, and it moves into the revolutions and Mexican history. And I think it's important both to understand, a growing population in the United States, but probably more importantly to understand ourselves, because oftentimes with American history, the problem is it's told in a vacuum, and it's not told in the proper context of a larger civilization. And so we think certain things are just absolutely obvious and clear, which are not obvious and clear. Questions of foundations of government, the nature of government authority, whether a state, a nation, what culture should be, basically agnostic in its approach to religion. We take all that as obvious, but when you see a country like Mexico, you begin to see that there are other ideas that are at work in play in society, and those ideas come and they clash with ideas that come from the United States. So you began to think on a broader level. It's even better, of course, if you're doing European history, and to see the United States in context with that. Now, I don't think the point is to see the United States primarily. I think that the point is to know this history. I mean, Mexico and Europe are not just foils for the United States. The book I talked to you about earlier that I used in school, one of my criticisms of it was that it made it seem like all of the development of Europe coalesced and found perfection in the United States, like it was all there just for the sake of the United States. And so you kind of have a kind of pan-European thing, but all of a sudden you're just talking about England.
Exactly. So yes, so fascinating. My family and I went to Jamestown. We went to the real site of Jamestown, and you have the park rangers who are giving the tour, and they're talking about how horrendous the conditions were. But he gave us the broader perspective. They just said, England did not have the naval power. It was not as, there is Spain and Florida, and it had the conditions been better for starting, or, basically it was like people that were punished in England, it was like either you are hung or sent to Jamestown. People would prefer to be hung because they knew it was so terrible. So Spain never even tried at that point. And I thought that was so eye-opening for my children, for my whole family, to really get this broader perspective that it isn't, like, as you said, let's just look at America as the center of the world, put it in a historical perspective.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we wanted to have books which would inspire wonder, the desire for knowledge, because we're convinced that, man, as Aristotle and St. Thomas said, man is a rational animal. That's the definition of man. We have all the animal passions and the like, and bodies and the whole business. But what really distinguishes us is the fact that we can know, and we can will too. I mean, will is obviously important, but before you can will something, you have to know it. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to inspire that love of knowledge, which is, I think, just being killed constantly in our society through technology, through the culture, all different ways, other things. It's being killed almost in a special way by the educational system.
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. And of course, I represent a lot of homeschoolers who are trying to actually
Mhm.
reclaim that for their families.
Right, and I think that's so that love of knowledge, the understanding that knowledge is good, not because it gives you a good job, not because it gives you position and standing in society. Might do all those things, but if it doesn't do any of those things, it's still good. It's good in and of itself.
Mhm.
Knowledge is the perfection of the human mind. And wisdom ultimately is that perfection. And you can only find that through seeking to know, to living your life in such a way that you're always trying to learn, whatever your position is, no matter what you do in life. Based on one's gifts and one's opportunities, one always seeks to know. So it's the liberal education, right? The principle of liberal education, not the Democratic Party education, but liberal in the sense of that which frees, right? That which frees us to be fully human. So that was another aspect, and I think that being Catholic, what we've been attempting to do and trying to do is recover the real tradition of Catholic education, which has been fairly killed so much in the United States and throughout the world since the 20th century, where you have Catholic schools aping the standards and the measures undertaken by public schools, right? And so they set the standard, and we try to measure up. Whereas really, we have the superior education. Because it's actually rooted in what it means to be human. So it's even pre-Catholic. It goes back to Greece and Rome. So that's one of the big inspirations of what we've been setting out to do.
And I would say it was very inspiring. I love to tell the stories, the fruits of your work. My son, as I said, did take that class, Lands of Hope and Promise. I think you were teaching it at the time on Homeschool Connections. And you had just published a book. In fact, we were just like, I don't think it was in hardback. It was like digital that first time. And we went through it together. It was amazing. And then fast forward, he's my youngest who went to the local college. He's a business major of all things, but still has a strong love of history. And he had to take a history class, and there he is immersed in secular history. And there he was researching and bringing to class the broader perspective that he had learned foundationally from doing things like working through your book with you. So
good. I'm glad to hear that. It's always encouraging.
Yeah. As a teacher it is, but to know that the fruits of that gives that legacy, is giving the foundation for the next generation.
Right. Yeah, I want to, if I may, just add what we mean by Catholic history.
Yes.
Because we do tell these books from the perspective of the Catholic faith. And I understand why when people first hear that, they say, well, then it's just biased. You're just making stuff up, right? What is Catholic history? It's like Catholic said before, what's Catholic mathematics? It doesn't exist. In a sense, it's true. Catholic history doesn't exist. The term history, historia in Latin, means an inquiry. It can also mean a narration, a narrative. What history is, an inquiry into human actions and events of the past, trying to come to know what happened, and as best you can, why it happened. So in both of those, oftentimes when you study history, you find oftentimes you don't even know what happened. It's not clear what happened. I'm working on one of our next books for freshman level high school. I'm going through the medieval period in the 9th and 10th centuries, and sometimes you just don't know. There's not enough, the records aren't there. So when we talk about history, we're talking about the inquiry, which since the 19th century has become very scientific. We're also talking about the events themselves. So in a sense, the inquiry, there's nothing specifically Catholic or anti-Catholic or non-Catholic about the inquiry. It's kind of neutral in terms of being Catholic. However, nobody writes history without a perspective. If you're the modern historians who pretend like they're objective, they're not. They come from a certain perspective. It could be a Protestant perspective. It could be a secular perspective. It could be a Catholic perspective. But we all come from that perspective, and that's something we have to take into account when we're telling the story of history. That perspective for Catholics, obviously Catholic. Well, now, does that mean I simply blithely believe anything that a saint said, or even with, but say, to take the life of Christ? If I look at the Gospels, do I just say, okay, the Gospel said it, that's it? Or do I submit even the Gospels to a certain kind of historic scrutiny? It's the latter. That's when we try to do. You try to see the Gospels as historical documents, and I don't think there's anything impious about that. It's just that's what they are. They're historical documents, and they can be examined based upon that. I think so being Catholic means you respect the actual demands of the discipline that you're following. If you're a mathematician, you respect mathematics. If you're a philosopher, you respect philosophy and the actual inquiry of those disciplines. When you're doing history, you respect the demands of the historical discipline, the scientific apparatus that goes into it. I think one of the big differences is that we Catholics, and this thing, I guess, could go for anybody who believes in God, but we have a broader vision of the world than, say, a secular materialist does. For the secular materialist, there is nothing else but the material causes. All causes of history are going to be economic, or they're going to be environmental. They can't. A secular historian is, because of his assumptions, can't accept miracles, for instance. So he's limited. He has to find some non-miraculous explanation for the certain events which seem very well documented, such a thing
like Fatima,
Yeah, exactly. There's a number of different things you can point out like this. As a Catholic, let's take Fatima example. As a Catholic historian, I don't come at Fatima saying, oh, the church has said it's believable, therefore it happened, or pious people say it happened, therefore it happened. I have to look at the event of Fatima in a manner which is in accord with the historical discipline. I have to see what's the evidence, right? I can't just be pious. I have to be it has to be evidence based. But I can actually entertain the idea that something miraculous did happen.
Right. That's beyond our our physical ability to recognize something. Yeah, exactly. Right. Broaden that inquiry, as you say, that search for knowledge.
Right. So I can entertain a lot more. I think also being Catholic, we have a sense through our faith of the trajectory of history. Now, again, we can't just take this, our assumed trajectory, our ideas of providence, and just sort of explain everything by them.
Or do we say God's sort of, or be a deist perspective where he's just set everything in motion and boom, we're on our own.
Right. So we have to do the work. At the same time, but we can entertain, accept, and seek to understand history in light of what's revealed, without shortchanging history, without being simplistically pious. We can actually say, there seems to be a movement. This happened. These seem to be providential events. I'm thinking like a historian like Christopher Dawson. Where he talks about, who asks the questions, he talks about the role of religion. And you can tell his understanding of the role of religion in his histories comes from being Catholic. But you would never say that this man is being, he's a duped Catholic, or he's trying to dupe us with slight historical sleights of hand. He argues from the actual evidence of history. But he does it as a Catholic. Yeah. He can entertain that providential aspect of history. So I think, and I think too, being Catholic, if you really are being Catholic, you don't treat your history as a propaganda piece, like so much of history is being done now, unfortunately, in the schools.
Yes, it is. Oh my goodness. And that is one of the hardest things, Christopher, especially when we talk about homeschool materials. We have different viewpoints, secular, even our beautiful, brothers and sisters in Christ, who have certain perspectives that you're right. It's all about pushing down that evangelical propaganda as part of, even within science or math, just trying, here's another opportunity to get somebody in the door of my faith. So yeah, that's again why I love the breath of fresh air in terms of the perspective of your textbooks in the project.
Yeah, part of our perspective too is what we want to make sure to do is be honest. The tendency always is to protect your own, right?
Yes.
And there's often been this idea amongst certain Catholics that you only play up the good parts of the faith. You kind of hide all the bad stuff. And
yes.
And our perspective has always been, we're going to tell this story, warts and all. We're going to tell about the bad popes. We're going to talk about the abuses that occurred in the church, how Catholics have fallen short time and again. And I think if you don't do that with students, they're going to find it out from somebody, and maybe not even in a particularly accurate fashion, but they'll find it out from somebody, and they're going to turn around and say to you, why didn't you tell me this, right?
Yeah.
We can at least tell it. We can tell those stories with the perspective of the faith. We can explain it in relation to the faith in a way that nobody else can.
Would you say, Christopher, that it's also from a standpoint of when you're seeking truth, you're not afraid that the things you're going to find out are just because the truth never contradicts itself. It's central. It's just leading you to a closer relationship to his story.
Right. Yeah. And that's so I guess in a way you put it, Catholic history is just history told by Catholics.
Yes, exactly. It's not a tool to, again, propaganda. Right. It's not to prove a point. It is the unraveling of truth, of what's happened, and being able to open your mind to that perspective. And what you're going to find is not always beautiful, is it, Christopher? Because it's humanity working in this world, this sinful world.
And you're going to find there are admirable people who aren't Catholic. Sometimes there are people who are more admirable than some non-Catholics are more admirable than other Catholics. Even with, if you take somebody like Martin Luther, for instance, it's very wrong to go and just treat Luther like he was a devil and not try to understand the man. Being raised Lutheran, I always have a certain residual piety towards Martin Luther. People might think that's weird, but it's hard being raised in a faith where you're told that Luther is the second St. Paul, right, for so many years, and not to feel like he's a certain paternal figure. It's almost rather like finding out your father was a rat, right? I'm not saying about Luther was entirely a rat. But there was admirable things about Luther. There are things we have to understand about Luther, and it just makes history boring if Luther is just a black hat. He's just a bad guy.
Yes.
It's easy to dismiss bad guys.
It's easy to scapegoat as well, too.
Right.
Isn't it?
Right. And Napoleon is another character I find fascinating, and the complexity of a man like Napoleon is fascinating. And so that will lead to wonder. Students will say, well, there's these people who did things which we think are wrong, but yet they're not entirely bad. And there are people who are doing good things who are not entirely good. It'll get them to thinking, right? If we can guide them directly, we can get them to understand. For instance, like the church is not her members. We're all members of the body of Christ, but the church ultimately transcends that, the earthly reality of it.
Well, like you said about talking about the bad popes again, too. I had a beautiful dear priest who said, when you look at the church, we have to look at it in 500-year chunks, not like what's going on this year versus last year. And this overarching, the Holy Spirit protecting the church, guiding it, keeping it, true to Christ's church.
Right. So I guess I think I've said about everything about the Catholic history.
But it's so important for our parents to hear this, Christopher. It really is important, very, very important, and just the guiding light as to what we pick, how we work, how we inspire our teenagers, what we give them. And so what is coming next? Let's talk about those historical fiction books before we wrap things up. What
Well,
else can we expect from Catholic Textbook Project?
well, the historical fiction books are not Catholic Textbook Project. Those are
No,
mine.
they're yours,
Yes,
right?
right. But so I have to make that disclaimer. It's important. From Catholic Textbook Project, we published an 8th grade. It could be going to print, hopefully very soon, an 8th grade American history text, because there was a lot of requests from that, particularly from Catholic schools. Our hope was that we could just have people do modern European history in 8th grade, but it didn't work.
Yes.
I mean, people use the book Lights and Nations too, but this is going to be an alternative for 8th grade, and there's a tremendous amount of interest, and orders are really flying through the roof. I'm currently working on a book. It was one of the first books, actually. Dr. Roland Laster did a lot of it, and it's a history that goes basically from prehistory to the Renaissance. It's a big chunk. But I'm in the Middle Ages right now, so that's something I hopefully will have done next year. But with everything else we do, we have a very small staff. So,
okay. All right. We will pray for you in getting those books out. They have been, yeah. So, but tell us about your own. And again, one of the things I encourage families when I'm teaching them about history, family style, and the importance of, yes, that framework text, but then immersing yourself in that time period, because we very often view history from our modern mindset. What about historical fiction and being able to recreate and immerse ourselves in that? And that's one of the inspiration for the trilogy. Tell us about that.
Well, the trilogy, I mean, first of all, it's not a teen trilogy. So I know there's a lot of teen. I mean, I would say you'd have to be older to really understand it. Actually, my daughter, who's 20-something, she read it for the first time, and she said she's glad she didn't read it when she was younger, because she didn't understand all the themes. So I would say it's more for adults than it is for children. Not that there's anything really nasty in it. It's just
well, like as you said, it's like reading Christian Lavransdatter and about Norway. I think being a married woman reading it versus a teenager, you get a totally different perspective of the beautiful story. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So
life experience makes a difference in what we read. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the trilogy it goes from roughly 1506 to 1550. And it deals with a young man who actually gets drawn into the Reformation. And it's about him. The central story is him and a woman, and of course, the young girl he meets, but their relationship and in the context of all of that. So the first one that's been published, by Arouca. Mm-hmm. It's called A Song for Elsa, ELSE, and the first volume is called The Vow, and it's Arouca Press. It's AROUCA.
Yeah, and we'll put the links below this video, so I have those links. And
I'm so non-technological. I don't know these things.
Well, so many of our homeschool parents are they're getting educated, and they want this good, literature and materials and a sense of history. So I'm so glad you're writing these.
Yeah. So the first volume actually that goes right up to the verge, the beginning, right before the Reformation begins. So it doesn't actually have those events in it, but it has, you get a context, a sense of the time. The second volume goes through what are called the heroic years of the Reformation from 1517 to 1526, and pretty much culminate in the rather brutal, bloody peasants' rebellion in Germany in 1525. And the last volume goes up to, the last volume has been the hardest to write. Mm-hmm. Second volume was easy in a sense because there's so much good material you could draw from. When you get this from 1526 to 1550, there's a lot of imperial diets and meetings, and so you have to try to find things to actually, make the story more. It was just more difficult to write. But that's basically the time period. There are some historical characters who appear in it. Martin Luther is one of them. Philip Melanchthon. There's some others. I probably have my portrayal of Luther would probably maybe tick off both Catholics and Protestants, because I think I present him as the complex character he was, and how at the beginning he was a different man than he was at the end. And,
yes.
but that's basically it. Yeah. So it's the first volume has been published. We're going through the proofing of the second volume. That's just about finished. I just have to plug in all the changes, and then it goes, the typical process where it gets laid out, and you have to read it through again and find any mistakes, and then it's. So I'm hopefully this summer the second volume will be out.
So a word about writing, because I said we have this great new group. They are so energized, these young Catholic teen authors. And again, the mission of that whole program is to be authentically yourself as a Catholic and just write stories instead of using it as, shoving in Catholic things. But would you say you were always a writer, Christopher? Because I mean, you're just prolific, and is it a job? Is there's like one thing I'd love for you to just inspire these teen young authors who feel inspired to write?
I always wanted to be a writer. I wrote when I was in high school. I wrote for a while. I even wrote poetry. I don't know if it was any good, but what really propelled me, I went to college. I went to TAC. I did whatever writing I had to do there. But then when I got out of college, I wanted to write. But I sometimes what happens when you don't have to write for a living is that you worry so much about your style. You keep thinking, my gosh, is this perfect? Is this just right? And you go over and over, and then after a while it does get bad because you're overthinking the thing. What helped me, and unfortunately the avenues for this are not as common as they once were, was I had to go. I got a job as a journalist. I edited. At first, I wrote for 2 Catholic monthlies in California. I became the editor of one of the first one and then the other, and I had to write to make a living. So I had to push out 1,000 word, 1,500 word article every month, at least one. Yeah. And I didn't have time to worry about my style at that point. I just had to write, and that helped. That helped tremendously. I stopped thinking about that sort of thing. I mean, not that I don't go and try to prove things, but at a certain point, I just say, that's it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what we're doing with them is we give them a challenge each month, and we have a young man, Dominic D'Souza, who's managing, and we're bringing in Catholic authors. But that's exactly it. You're right. That is so important. They have to, there's deadlines. It's just that ability to say, you've got 1 month, here's the prompt. It's on fairy tales. This month it's on myths, and just get it done. Get it in there, and we'll publish it. So that understanding, that's so good. So helpful that you said that. It made a difference for you. Yeah, it's great. Well, before we wrap things up, any last parting words you like to say? I mean, we can spend another hour talking about history, so close to my heart, and obviously yours.
Yeah, I don't know. I would just say parents engaged in homeschooling, be very careful that you cultivate a sense of love of learning, a sense of wonder. And one of the best ways you can do that is by cultivating a love of learning and a sense of wonder in yourselves. Yeah. I know when you're raising children, it's hard to have a sense of wonder, or you may wonder what you're doing wrong sometimes, right?
Different kind of wonder. What am I doing, this crazy thing? And then am I crazy? I'm homeschooling on top of it all.
But to the degree you can, try to cultivate that. I mean, there's lots of different things. You have natural interests, even if it's gardening or something. Study gardening to the degree you can. But a good book is important, but it's never as important as a good teacher. We need the good teachers out there, and if you're homeschooling, you're that teacher.
Yeah, St. John Paul II says that by just the virtue in his letter to families of being a parent, you are a teacher.
And you don't have to be. I just don't think worry so much about the technique. It's just, I think it's the ethos. It's the culture of learning that you try to cultivate. Culture of good music. Culture of good art. Take them on walks in the country, especially now that spring is coming, and just observe the beauty of nature. All beauty and truth and goodness all go together. And your children are going to be good to the degree they're also inculcated with wisdom and with beauty. And you can't just, morality is not something over here and, wisdom over here. They go together. What virtue is, right? Virtue finally comes from that word virtus, which is manly. It's manly strength. And what virtue is the perfection of ourselves as human beings. Right? That's what it is. It's strength. And what is that virtue? St. Thomas would refer to virtue as not only moral virtue, we always think of, right? But it's also intellectual. It's the virtue of the mind. And not everybody reaches those virtues, the intellectual virtue, to the same degree, but we can all participate in to some degree. And to the degree even parents can do that is important. And if you have a hard time doing it, try see what help you can get.
You have certainly made things accessible, and I say, even just as I encourage parents, read aloud. If you're finding you're not getting, don't just hand the book to the child. Let's read it aloud as a family. And
I think that's really important. And in fact, the more current books are younger, we have little pronunciation guides for names, but like the Nations 2 in the teacher manual, it actually has an appendix where you can learn the pronunciation of names, because I know some of these, it could be jaw crackers.
Yes, they can. So much help in the teacher's manuals. Oh my goodness, it's beautiful, including some musical pieces, the timelines, historical novels that complement it. So yeah, it's beautiful. There is help out there, and I'll put in a shameless plug for the Catholic homeschool community, which is the place to get support and help, and we're there, growing together. Thank you for bringing up that point about parents, the call. We all have a call to holiness, and to model that for our children comes first from our own seeking wonder and knowledge. So, thank you so much, Christopher, for joining me today. Again, what a pleasure. I will mention once again, if you're looking for the links for Christopher's general editor, the managing editor for the Catholic Textbook Project.com, and then please do join me in the Catholic homeschool community on it. Thank you again, and may God bless you abundantly. Bye now. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find us on all your favorite podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Thank you, and have a blessed day.